Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucas, and I work in the Curatorial programs team here at the gallery. Thank you for joining us for today's Curatorial Roundtable for the exhibition Nothing's Forever, Rethinking Sculpture in Singapore. Is Forever surveys sculpture in Singapore from the 19th century to the present and is the largest exhibition dedicated to the topic in 30 years. The exhibition advances an expanded notion of the sculptural and proposes a pivotal role that artists and their diverse sculptural concerns have played in the development of modern and contemporary art in Singapore. It is a beautiful exhibition just down the hall at our Ngee Ann Kong Si Concourse Gallery, and we're excited to have the curators of the show speak about it today. Our moderator for today is Mr. Jeffrey Say. I'll introduce him before handing the floor over to him. Jeffrey is an art historian specializing in Singapore and Southeast Asian art history who has undertaken pioneering research and study of sculpture in pre- and post-war Singapore. In 2009, he designed the world's first MA focusing on Asian modern and contemporary art histories at LASALLE College of the Arts, for which he is a program leader. Prior to LaSalle, Jeffrey was a curator at what was then the Singapore History Museum, where he oversaw the collection of Buddhist and Indian artifacts. A public advocate for the importance of art history to Singapore, Jeffrey is a frequent public speaker at museums, universities, and galleries, and conducts popular short courses. An author of numerous essays on art, he is also the editor of Histories, Practices, Interventions, a reader in Singapore Contemporary Art. His follow-up book, Intersections, Innovations, and Institutions, a reader in Singapore Modern Art, has just been published this month. Both titles are stocked by major booksellers and libraries. With that, I hand the floor over to Jeffrey. Jeffrey, thank you.
Thanks, Lucas, for that very kind introduction. By the way, our book, Eugene and myself, right, our co-editor book is not out. That's the second volume, right, of the reader. It'll be published at the end of the month, and we will launch it, I think, in October, early October, right? But you can already pre-order. Right, okay, in major bookshops. So, sorry, a bit of marketing. Major bookshops, yes, like Amazon, book depository and all that. Okay, so this afternoon we are going to have a conversation, right? So I want to stress the term conversation with the curators of Nothing Lasts Forever, Rethinking Sculpture in Singapore. So that's the whole idea of a roundtable, right? Is really to hear firsthand from the curators, how this show or various aspects of the show is curated, right, and also beyond. Okay, so I have beside me, right, the four curators of the exhibition. On my right, Eugene. Extreme right, Shujuan. Extreme left, Joleen. And beside me, on my left, is Jia Yun. Right. Okay, and so let me preface this session, right, by making some personal remarks. So in the early 2000s, I actually submitted a proposal, okay, to have a sculpture show at the Singapore Museum. Okay, they liked the idea, okay, but for some reason I can't remember now, right? It was shelved, right? I don't know whether it's still shelved, but in any case, so after that I approached what was then Sculpture Square, the now defunct Sculpture Square, right, for a similar show, probably a smaller scale because of the space, but also that also fell through. Okay, for some reason I can't actually remember. I don't know whether it's to do with finance or anything like that, okay, or budget. Okay, and then I was going through my file that day and I actually found that I've written a proposal to NGS, and I can't remember whether I proposed it, right? Maybe Eugene could remember, but. Yeah, I did propose it.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, I did, okay. Right, so what I'm saying is that, my idea of a sculpture show is really a conventional one, right? I mean, sculpture in a conventional sense, a modern sense, okay? But here, in this show, the curators have regarded sculpture in an expanded sense, right? We'll discuss that later, okay? So I'm really delighted, personally delighted that NGS has finally managed to put together a major survey show on sculpture after 31 years. In fact, after 31 years. so yeah, so I'm going to kick off this. So I will say congratulations to the curators, right, for putting this show. So I would like to kick off this roundtable, right, the question with the title of the exhibition. Okay, first the main title, right, the main title, Nothing Lasts Forever. So I believe that was a quote taken from an interview with Tang Dawu. Okay, and so why this title, and how does this title kind of set the thematic, direction and framework for the exhibition? So that's my first question.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey, and I hope our exhibition in a way met your expectations as well. um, yeah, and you're also thinking of putting in maybe a publication, right, on sculpture. So hopefully, after our reader on the modern in Singapore is published and realized, this is your next project that you can do. Yeah. So about the exhibition title, Nothing is Forever, Rethinking Sculpture in Singapore. It's really a quote taken from the artist Tang Dawu. I'm sure you have also read our wall text, and that gives the context about how Dawu in an interview with TK Sabapathy, and which was also published, talked about how sculpture itself could be thought of in different ways as an expanded field, to quote from Rosalind Krauss, and how the elements of sculpture, right, could also be taken and derived from nature. So elements, such as the wind, the earth, the sun. So all these elements that we do not conventionally consider as materials for sculpture, could be considered and used by sculptors as materials to make sculpture. Right? And in that way, kind of expanding our understanding and definition of sculpture, which is a continuously evolving one. And I think that is the premise of the exhibition, right? To think about the definition, or rather the evolving definition of sculpture, and how it continuously raises questions about how we understand both the histories of the modern as well as contemporary art in Singapore, which I'm sure we will unpack later on as we discuss more questions as well. So which comes back to the subtitle of the exhibition, Rethinking.
Yeah, that's my next question.
Right, about rethinking.
Yes.
But maybe for rethinking, okay, I'll just start off and
No, my next question is really, really, what does the show want us to rethink about sculpture, right?
But maybe before we go to the second question, maybe the rest of the curators would like to respond to the title, which, as you know, how exhibition titles go, there's a lot of discussion about it, and it's really up to the end that we finally nail, and decide, the exhibition title that we're going to use, right? So maybe if any one of you would like to share.
Okay, I can say something. So apart from the, Dawu's quote on how, elements of the wind can also be sculptural materials, I do think that on one level, Nothing is Forever also speaks about some of the works in the show. I mean, you would expect sculpture or even public monuments to be there forever. But as you can see for the Hindu temple sculptures, it is also subject to a lot of conditions that could be beyond, the artist's hands and yeah. So I just feel that it also speaks to sculpture on that level, like nothing is forever. It's ever changing. So life is ever changing, but so is, making art. Yeah. So that's for me on the level.
Yeah, and if you think about Nothing is Forever, it also challenges our assumptions of sculpture, because we would think that sculpture are made from materials that are very hardy and long-lasting, such as bronze, stone, granite. So these are very hardy materials, and of course sculptors have used them, including marble, right, as well, and so. Can we think about perhaps sculpture in a different way, whereby these materials could be ephemeral, it could be transient, they could be using organic materials as well, and of course these materials do not last. So I think it's really a way in which we wanted to challenge the assumptions, perhaps that many of us might have about what sculpture is. And through this, perhaps, then kind of redefine what we think, sculpture can be.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess another focus that we had for this show was public art. And that's something we discussed quite frequently in the lead up to this exhibition. We thought that the title was also in a way provocative, and it kind of reminds us to not take our public artworks for granted, because often they sometimes can lack care and maintenance, and often people assume that they're just going to be there forever and that we have the space for them. But actually, they do need a lot of care and maintenance regularly. So in a way, the title also not just references sculpture as a medium, but also the kinds of infrastructures or operations and logistics that happen behind the scenes when it comes to the production of sculpture, and especially public art. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that as well, other than dimensions of the public and also the materiality of sculpture, I think the title really is evocative of ideas around permanence that are very much associated with the function of the museum as a cultural institution. It's to preserve and to protect something that is then meant to kind of withstand the kind of vicissitudes of time. But increasingly, what artists are also then interested in are forms of making that are not so permanent, that escape this kind of fixed art object. So artists like Dawu, for example, Tang Dawu, who we're quoting, is an especially kind of key example of that as well, where he taps into other elements that are involved and roped into his object making, which then is not necessarily working towards a final and always kind of conservable object. So I think that, placing this statement at the beginning of our exhibition, or as the title of our exhibition, also sets up that provocation for us to think about art objects, not only in that permanent, durable way, but also in the sense of artistic or sculptural gestures that can exist in time and in space, and then no longer. Yeah.
Thanks for those responses. I think we'll have time later, definitely, in fact, it's one of my questions, right? To talk about the expanded notion of sculpture, right? And also, I think Joleen anticipated, one of my questions on public art. Okay, I think there's quite a bit of, to discuss, about that, right? But if you don't notice, because, this, I think this exhibition was done, is it in collaboration with the ASEAN, the COCI or something?
We had support from the ASEAN, Connect ASEAN.
Right, Connect, right.
And they gave us funding really to work on the ASEAN sculpture parks or sculpture gardens, of which, of course, the first was at Fort Canning here in Singapore. And it then also kind of continued to 5 other ASEAN sculpture parks across Southeast Asia in the capital cities. So altogether we have 6 ASEAN sculpture parks. And I'm just wondering how many of you have been to the one in Singapore, Fort Canning? Yeah, quite a lot, which is great. Many years ago, they used to have a signage there that says ASEAN Sculpture Park, but it has disappeared. So, if you go to the park now, you wouldn't know that it was really part of the ASEAN Sculpture Parks. And of course, there are many others, including the one in Bangkok. So the one in Bangkok is near Chatuchak. Right? And so, when you go there to do your shopping, right, over the weekend, actually there's a beautiful park just beside it. And they have recently kind of renovated. So there's a new part to the park as well. But the ASEAN Sculpture Park in Bangkok, in Chatuchak, is actually in the older part of the park. So yes, if you go to Bangkok, and you go to Chatuchak, please do drop by the ASEAN Sculpture Park there.
Yes. Well, can we talk a little bit about the curatorial process, right? So we'll begin with the curatorial concept and the 4 themes of the exhibition. Okay, so what was the thought process behind that?
The thought process, I would say maybe it would be good, maybe if Jia Yun, you can start with, because we started with also Jimmy Ong's work. And maybe that's a nice entry point to talk about the 4 themes of the exhibition.
I think in in the case of Jimmy Ong's work, for what he calls these Raffles effigies, 4 of which hang in the gallery space. Jimmy. Jimmy was very much interested in revisiting this public monument, that still stands today in 2022 along the Singapore River. And what is very interesting, I think, about the fact that such a monument has a connection and a relevance to a contemporary artist like Jimmy Ong is that, the figure of Raffles is someone that still stands a lot, or as an icon or symbol of our colonial past and our colonial history. And in fact, if you look at the history of where this sculpture was emplaced and why it wasn't taken down after our independence, you'll be able to also see that it has this kind of strategic national kind of importance, thanks to Albert Winsemius, who advised the current government that it shouldn't be taken down post-1965. So with Jimmy, what he does is really revisit, but also interrogate Raffles and the place that he has within Singapore, not only Singapore, but also Java's history. And, with that, he actually then begins to stitch and stuff a much more kind of feminized version of Raffles. But in this case, the Raffles effigies are rendered in batik fabrics that were sourced and stitched together by seamstresses that were based in Jogja at the time. And what is then fascinating about Jimmy's work is that he actually then proceeds to unstitch and unstuff these works as a response to our Singapore bicentennial. So we put this work at the beginning of the exhibition because I think it really connects to the 4 themes, the first of which is the idea of the monument and the role of patronage in Singapore. And this, I think, will link very much to the wider discussion around public sculpture that we'll be having throughout this roundtable. And the second being the spiritual. And what do we mean by the spiritual? I think we're very much interested in how artists in Singapore have manifested or rendered intangible values physically through their practice and through processes of abstraction and interpretation. In Jimmy's case, it's a little bit more tangential. He's actually incorporated stitched text from the Javanese ethics that he's had translated from English back into Sanskrit on each of these effigies. And the third deals with what some might call, quite an obvious and universal form of art, which is the human body, the corporeal. And here we can see how, something as simple as the Raffles of body still is charged with this significance around, how we think about colonial authority and power. And finally, we're looking at ideas around unmaking, making, unmaking, and remaking, which really explore ideas that came into currency around the 60s and 70s, where artists began to push against these very modernist forms of sculptural making. And Jimmy himself, then proceeds to create iterations of his works that have been intervened with through performance. So I think by opening with these works, we also wanted to set out to declare that it's not meant as a kind of a comprehensive survey of sculpture in Singapore, but to rather touch on themes and kind of impulses that really span, different across the 20th century of art making in Singapore.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the very detailed, responses. I suppose, yes, the Raffles sculpture is a highly charged work, right? Especially in the post-colonial era, right? Subject to a lot of critique. But so is the Malayan, right? We'll come to that perhaps. Hopefully we have time. Okay, I suppose the next question is, the works themselves, was there a criteria in selecting the works?
Of course, when thinking about the criteria, we have set up the thematic framework for the exhibition, and that really guided the selection of the works. So what really, I think, got us thinking about what to include and exclude, which is always part of the curatorial process, is to think about what has never been included or excluded from the histories of modern sculpture in Singapore. And in this, we examined two trajectories. First was really in terms of exhibition histories. So we looked at the histories of exhibitions focusing on sculpture in Singapore from the 1960s, I will say, maybe even 50s to the present. And we started to chart that history. And we realized that, hey, actually we had quite a number of exhibitions on sculpture. Right? As you can see here on the screen, these are just some of the exhibitions that we have highlighted from the 1960s and later in the 1990s. So you will see the first two exhibitions on sculpture in Singapore. The first was in 1967, right? And it involved, and there was a second edition on sculpture in Singapore in 1969, involving the same 7 artists that you see here, Ao Eng Kwang, Chung Tzu Ping, Lim Nan Seng, Lim Yu Guan, Ng Eng Teng, V.M. Hoisington, and Yeo Hui Bin. Right? And so it's interesting to look at this moment in the 1960s when we're looking at the histories of exhibitions. So 67 was the first one, and it was held at the National Library. If you were to go back one slide, we noticed there was another exhibitionary turn in the 1990s with the sculpture seminar in 1991, followed by the second sculpture seminar in 1993. So these were the two kind of exhibitionary turns that we observed within the history of sculpture in Singapore in the 1960s and the 1990s that also marked a different way of thinking about sculpture in Singapore. With the 1960s, we realized that most of the sculptures they were not just sculptors, they were also painters. So there was quite an interesting point, but not all of them, of course, were both sculptors and painters, but most of them were. I think the exception would be Hoisington and maybe Yeo Hui Bin being primarily sculptors. And Eng Teng did paintings as well. Yeah, so I would say maybe Hoisington and Yeo Hui Bin. Oh yeah, he also did paintings. Right? So it's kind of interesting that both, they make, sculpture and paintings. But it was really significant that they decided to organize an exhibition on sculpture, right, and focusing really on the practice of sculpture. And many of the artists, including Su Ping, for example, started to incorporate kind of industrial materials, including Hoisington, into their sculpture. So sculpture was no longer kind of just purely using conventional materials that we would think about sculpture, like bronze, stone, and so on, but they were starting to use industrial materials or everyday kind of materials, bolts, nuts. Su Ping used that a lot in his kind of assemblages into kind of sculptural reliefs. So it was kind of paintings that were also kind of moving into sculptural forms. If you think about Anthony Poon, as an example. So we thought it was probably a high modernist moment, perhaps, in the 1960s, and it could be seen in the sculpture exhibitions. And another turn happened in the 1990s with the sculpture seminars in 91 and 93, whereby sculpture became a much more practice. It became a practice that was more focused on concept and process rather than the finished work, which was why it was called a seminar. It was really led by Tang Da Wu again, right? And we think that was also interesting that we had a sculpture seminar and not a painting seminar, in the 1990s, and that really kind of marked perhaps a conceptual turn in Singapore that was thought through sculpture, a rethinking about what sculpture is. So in that aspect, I think we were also kind of looking at works that kind of expanded beyond a conventional definition of sculpture into installation and performance and also the conceptual. So I would say the first trajectory was really looking at the histories of exhibitions in sculpture. The second moment, or the second way in which we thought about this exhibition was really also through what I mentioned earlier, what was excluded. So by looking at the histories of exhibitions, we realized that what was excluded was really, for example, the funerary statuaries and religious sculptures that were excluded from the history of modern art in Singapore. So I just emphasize it's modern art in Singapore. So that has been excluded. So that was also a way for us to think through this exhibition and to decide perhaps what we can include, which is the religious, the Hindu sculptures that you see, and also the funerary statuaries from Bukit Brown. So for me, this was really the two ways in which we were thinking about what to include in this exhibition. But yeah, of course, please add on.
Yeah, I guess to also add on to, to continue on Eugene's point about the religious and funerary statues, we also were really interested in ideas of spirituality. Eugene earlier mentioned that, yeah, often in Singapore, modern art is often seen as separate from religious issues or religion, right, and spirituality. So we really tried to expand this narrative, not only by including them, but also including artists whose works derive from religious principles or their own spirituality, such as Kumari Nahapan, whose work is seen here. So that's something that we really tried to focus on in this exhibition. Another key consideration for us was also to foreground women artists, women sculptors. Sculpture is really predominantly a male activity at the time. There are very few women sculptors, and we've tried as much as possible to include them in the exhibition. So we've included Elsie Yu's flight series here. Many people, I would say, may not be familiar with her today, but some of you might already notice that we have many of her sculptures dotted around Singapore. She at the time received many private commissions, and it's interesting because there were artists like her who were able to sustain her practice simply based on private commissions. Then, of course, focusing on Dora Godin and Anaratnam Gunaratnam, whose sculpture we're showing for the first time. So women like this were very active, especially Anaratnam Gunaratnam was active in the 1950s, participating in many Singapore Art Society exhibitions. So we've tried as much as possible to show their works and highlight them. Also including mentioning in, I guess, the artwork labels that, it was difficult for women to have access to education, access to the right kind of networks so that you can exhibit your art, so that you can gain access to commissioners. Things like that were our considerations.
Thanks. I think you anticipated my question once again. Okay, I have a question pertaining to women sculptors later on, and also about the lineage of this show. Okay. In any case, I just want to ask, again, relating to the curatorial process. So, what were some of the major challenges in curating this show?
Yeah, I mean, as in any exhibition, there should be challenges. So, so it's wonderful for us to also kind of break new ground in terms of kind of on some very practical matters. Also, how do we install these large sculptures? Which in a way answers your question earlier, Jeffrey. It's very hard to organize an exhibition on sculpture because sculptures are very heavy, right, and they occupy space, and it's not easy to install these very large-scale sculptures as well. So I think it's a major undertaking. So it's we're very thankful that the gallery, and of course, in terms of the curators have been kind of identifying sculpture as an area. Both as a gap, both in our collection, but also curatorially, and also art historically, an important area for us to focus on. Yeah, but challenges-wise, besides working closely with our colleagues to install from our artwork exhibition and management team. I remember at night we were kind of installing almost close to midnight, or even later than midnight, with kind of all the kind of the A-frame, to kind of hoist. For example, Yo Hui Bin's sculpture, which is Zhong Zhen Ren, and it's weighing more than 300 kilograms, so it's 3 tons, and so it's really, I think, a collective effort, not just the curators, to install these very large-scale and heavy sculptures that you now see in the Spine Hall. And we're also very lucky that we have the Spine Hall, and we renovated it in time to show these large sculptures. I hope you enjoy them as well, and you can see them in the round. But these are more kind of, the practical difficulties. Other aspects really is to, and this is my way of acknowledging also my colleagues who work with us. So the exhibitions is not just the curators. It's also to work closely with the conservators. And of course, in the conservation of paintings has its own challenges, but objects, sculpture is also, and I would say particularly difficult because of the material. And you're dealing with not just the material itself, be it stone or the wide range of materials that we kind of work with, whether it's metal and so on. But also, some of these sculptures have paint on them at the same time. So it's really how to work with these different types of materials, and also in different contexts, right? For example, the Hindu sculptures, and we had many questions from our conservators on how do we conserve these, religious sculptures? Are they to be conserved in a different way, from the artworks, right? And so these were kind of discussions that we had. And I think what really got us also very interested is how we collaborated and worked with the Hindu Endowments Board to really to work with them closely in terms of how do we display these religious sculptures. Right? And if you look at for example, the installation view that you see here, right? And this particular kind of, the shelf itself is actually also derived from the gopuram, which is the kind of Hindu architecture structure that you see. It's split into 3 levels, and we discussed with them about how do we place, Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. Right? And they have to be placed in a certain order and a certain hierarchy. Right? And all that was really through discussions with the Hindu Endowments Board, and also previously the curator from the Indian Heritage Center, Nalina Gopal. So we are highly indebted to both the Hindu Endowments Board and also other curators and scholars as well. So I think that's another challenge and a new thing for us, right? To think about how do we display these religious sculptures.
And also you got, of course, several artists to recreate the works, right? Lim Shujuan and Tang Dao as well.
Yeah, so maybe Jia Yun can talk about Tang Dao's.
So it was quite an interesting process working with Dao. Interesting as in complex, as in because it began as a kind of a conversation around us loaning the work. So normally when you loan an artwork, you put it in a crate and then you move it to the National Gallery, uncrate, you do a condition check, and then you light the work. But in the case of Dao, he wanted to still have a very direct hand in the assembly of the artwork. And by assembly, he didn't mean kind of fixing one part onto another. He meant assembling it brick by brick and wire by wire on site, in situ. So after a lot of lengthy negotiations with our artwork exhibition management colleagues, who were also very supportive and collaborative, we were able to give the artists almost 2 weeks to work on site in the artwork handling area to draft the sculpture first, trying out different permutations of bricks to see what type of weight would hold best suspended above the wire. And then following the first week of trial and error, the second week was where he was then able to assemble the work directly on site. And so towards the kind of final formulation of the work, actually a lot of us were involved in scrunching the wire together. And, we'll ask the artist very carefully, so, where do you want this? And he said, just throw. But I mean, that being said, he did come in on the final day and scrunch a lot of the wire and kind of finish up, this cloud of 68 work that you see actually just in the concourse here. So it was a kind of a very great privilege, I think, to see him work directly on the work, because even though, we've chosen this title for the exhibition, Nothing is Forever, and talked about moving away from the art object as something that is directly created by the artist's hand, Dawu, I think, still is very much invested in the ways in which the artist is able to shape, these outcomes, and to also make that process a collaborative one. So that, I think, in itself also helps us to open up this idea around how this work would then be reconstructed, say, in the future. Is this actually a work that can be based on a set of instructions rather than a set of static objects? So we're still resolving this question also with our Heritage Conservation Center colleagues. And I think that is actually part of the importance of making this exhibition now, with the artists still having this very active role in making these works that we're able to support.
Yeah. Working with Dawu is never boring, right? Okay, and anyway, are you all planning to acquire like the work by Dawu or Lim Leong Seng for the museum?
So Lim Leong Seng's works, New Era and Rebuild, have already been accessioned and they have been acquired by the National Gallery Singapore. So Shujuan and myself worked on the two acquisitions. And in a very similar way to what Jia Yun was talking about, there are always problems in terms of remaking works, historical works that were ephemeral, right? And they are no longer, around today. And perhaps that's also part of the concept itself. In any case, if you look at New Era, when it was made at his Lim Leong Seng's first solo exhibition at the National Library, and he was using these plastics, right? Plastic bags, which was relatively new material, probably came in the 1960s. And started to be used, in many different ways. So it was almost like a miracle material. And it really talks about, the process of Singapore's, industrialization and developmentalism, right? The use of these plastics, which have now become such a major issue in terms of, our climate crisis today. But it was a new era back then, in the sense of the possibilities of this almost miracle material that had so many uses. Right? And when he kind of conceptualized this work, including Rebuild, that is made from steel rebars, we had a long discussion also with Mr. Lim Leong Seng, and the idea back then when he showed it, including Rebuild, was that because he had connections to construction companies, so he had access to these steel rebars that are used to reinforce the concrete, right? And when he kind of tied them together using the metal wires, when he showed it in 1970, was it 76? I think 76, at his solo exhibition. After the exhibition, the whole sculpture itself was then returned to its original function, which is he returned it back to the construction site. So it was a very sustainable way of thinking, kind of a cyclical economy that we talk about these days. It was very sustainable. But back then in the 70s, he had this concept already, which is why we don't have the work today, because it was returned to its original function, which is such a fascinating concept as well, in that sense, of how the whole debate about art and function, right? The importance of function and how function and non-function, right? How art should be non-functional in that sense, and he returned the materials, whether it's the plastic bags or the steel rebars, to their original function, which I think was quite a provocative gesture back then. But of course, now that we have historicized it, we are better able to understand the significance or the art historical significance of such conceptual kind of practices already in the 1970s. And of course, we can think of artists like Tang Dawu, Cho Cha Hyang, and also now Lim Leong Seng, in terms of how sculpture itself was also very much conceptual, and perhaps marks a certain turn, a conceptual turn in Singapore's art history.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. Lim Leong Seng will be launching his book, right, in November. I kind of strongly encourage you to get the book, right? It's full of images, right? A big book. And, and you'll be surprised that, as Eugene mentioned, he was so far ahead of his time, right? In the 70s, he was doing, works that no other artists were doing, right? including the one with the plastic bags, right, and all that. Okay, so yes, so a person like Lim Shujuan, right, we are just kind of rediscovering, right? I suppose he has been kind of under-acknowledged for a long time. Okay, I mean, we know him most famously as, you know, a creator of many of our public sculptures, right? But not those kind of radical works, right? You know, that he made in the 70s. Okay, I'm mindful of the time, you know, because I want to give about at least 20 minutes, right? I want to open it to the floor, right, for questions. Okay. So I'll come to go to the next question. Actually, this is about lineage, right? I mean, you mentioned the first sculpture show, the 7 artists who were, you know, involved in that. It was held in the National Library. Okay, and all the artists are represented here, except I think for Lim Shujuan, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, and then I suppose the show must have been so successful that they held it 2 years later with the same 7 artists in the Victoria Memorial Hall. Okay. And then in 76 was the next landmark sculpture show. It was in the National Museum Art Gallery. I think it was in conjunction with their opening, right? The opening of the National Museum Art Gallery in 1976. That was quite a big show as well, if I'm not mistaken, right? And of course, Eugene mentioned the 1991 show that coincided with the sculpture seminar, right? And if you have a chance, you know, get your hands on the book, Sculpture in Singapore, right, which TK Savapati wrote. You can't buy it now, right, but you can certainly, you know, loan it from the library, right, because there are interviews there with Dawu. I mean, with quite a number of artists, including Dawu and Ping Ting and people like that. Okay, so I mean, you have partly answered that question earlier, but you know, my question is, you know, how do you situate this exhibition within this lineage, right? I mean, was there a kind of continuity or, you know, a kind of rupture or, you know, yeah, or are you building it on these shows or, you know, anything like that? Yeah, thanks.
I think we built on the previous exhibitions, right? As you can see here, and Jeffrey rightly pointed out, we have the 1976 sculpture show, which was curated by Constance Shears at the National Museum Art Gallery. And it was quite significant because 76 was the year the National Museum Art Gallery opened, and they chose to, you know, have an exhibition on sculpture, which really shows how important sculpture was and still is, and the relevance of sculpture, right? And to talk about the lineage, perhaps one way in which the curators were thinking about also is perhaps it was sculpture, even more so than painting or any other practices that provoked new ways of thinking about and making art. As you can see in the 2 exhibitions, you know, in the 60s and the sculpture seminar in the 1990s, new ways of thinking about art, towards the conceptual, towards process, towards, you know, a kind of use of even, you know, conventionally non-art materials in sculpture, and into which then leads us into the installative and the performative as well. I say that because if you look at the artist's village, and for example, if you look at practices of Tang Dawu, right, and in terms of, you know, how he makes his performances, it's always, I would say almost always with an object or objects, right? It's never a pure performance using just his body. You know, you think about Tiger's Whip, you know, for example, right? He wouldn't just even use them as props. You know, they were very much integral to his performance. And why so? So why do, you know, artists like Dawu, you know, when he makes performances, you know, will then, you know, kind of incorporate the object into part of his performance. So for us, we are thinking of the kind of connections between performance and installation, and what, you know, actually connects, you know, these 2 practices that we widely regard as contemporary art practices today is actually sculpture, a rethinking about what sculpture is, and its evolving definition, and why, you know, artists continue to use the object, the sculpture, the sculptural object. And if you looked at Eng Seng, for example, in Humanity, Nurturing Humanity, and we have displayed the trophy, of course, with archival images of his performance at the Artist Village as part of the Time Show in 1989 that went over to 1990 because it was a 24 hours event. Again, he's using his body, right? But the object is very prominently used as part of his performance. So we think perhaps it was really always, through an interrogation of sculpture that we can better understand, the performative and installative practices of our artists in Singapore.
Okay, another way we build on it is that Jeffrey mentioned T.K. Sababati's sculpture in Singapore book 1991. I think in his essay, he also wrote about how the first sculptural expressions were actually, these Hindu temple sculptures in addition to the public sculptures, but these were actually never shown in an exhibitionary aspect. So I think this is the first time that we actually did that as well. So you may have noticed the book by Marco Schuh as well. In a chapter on sculpture, he also mentioned, one of the first few paragraphs were really also talking about, he used the term craftsman, translated as craftsman, to talk about all these, sculptural expressions, but these we also feel that deserve a space, a time for their histories to be spoken about. And therefore, we actually also built on their writings and included them in this exhibition. Yeah.
Thanks. On Shujun's point, I think, unfortunately, we can't bring the sculptures from Haw Par Villa, right? Here. Okay. Anyway, those sculptures, yes, in Haw Par Villa, right? Again, like the traditional, Hindu sculptures, right? Okay. How do you regard them? Okay, so for the next question, I think before posing the question, I'd like to make some remarks, right? I think the 1991 sculpture show was quite a radical show. I think we agree on that, because they included works that are not often regarded as sculpture in the conventional sense, right? Such as the 3 thermos flasks, okay, that's now displayed in the Contemporary Art, the Singapore Gallery, okay, by Fazli Fadil. And that kind of, sparked quite a bit of discussion about what sculpture is. Okay, so that show, right, in 91, right, had done much to destabilize, right, our kind of definition, right, of what sculpture is. But I think this show, okay, has in some ways gone even further. They are not traditionally associated with sculpture, such as, for example, Chinese seals, ceramics. Can you hear me somehow? Is it okay? Right, sorry. Ceramics and even performance art, as Eugene just mentioned, or rather the objects, right, used in that performance. So I think in this regard, this show is a provocative one, right, but it could also be potentially problematic, okay, especially to lay people or the purists, okay, who come with a certain fixed mindset of what sculpture is, right, mass, volume, medium specificity, materiality, three-dimensionality, okay. So for example, I'm not surprised if already people who have a difficult time accepting Tang Da Wu's work as sculpture, okay, or see Lim Yong Seng's, or they will see Lim Yong Seng's work as installation, for example. So what's the difference between installation and sculpture, right? Or the works by artists investigating monuments, right? The video that you see inside as performance, okay? How is that sculpture, right? But at the same time, we know that the definition of sculpture, as I think several of them curators mentioned, has expanded when art historian Rosalind Krauss wrote her 1979 influential essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. All right, so this essay is actually about what sculpture had become in the second half of the 20th century, right, when art entered the so-called, right, postmodern era. Okay, so she states that surprising things have come to be called sculpture. Okay, so sculpture could encompass a much broader range of mediums, such as photography, even books, lines on walls, mirrors. Right? So in Krauss' models, sculpture in the expanded field include marked sites, site construction, axiomatic structures, etc. So I'm just thinking, right, so here's my question, about the challenges of educating people about what sculpture is, especially for the museum docents, some of whom are sitting here, right, when they are explaining such works to the public. In expanding the definition of sculpture, a la Rosalind Krauss, are we saying then that anything can be sculpture?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, we have great faith in our audience who come to the National Gallery Singapore, that they want to be challenged and provoked in different ways of thinking about art. That is also something I hold dear, and something that we, as curators, take on as an assumption. Right. So I think, of course, on the other hand, it's obviously not an easy show to understand. Right? For that, we have different kinds of exhibitions at the gallery, and some, especially if you have noticed exhibitions in the Nian Gongxi Concourse gallery, the exhibitions tend to be a bit more kind of demanding in that sense, and I think for us, of course, there are various ways in which curators, working very closely with our docents, try to make the exhibition as accessible as possible. Of course, we do that through various ways, such as our extended labels, the wall text, the section text, the brochures that we provide, all help to enable our audience to understand what the exhibition is about, and maybe also not to be overly didactic, but to encourage them, maybe to pique their curiosity, right? To think about a different way of understanding sculpture, which may not be right or wrong, but a way for us to think about perhaps we should reconsider what sculpture is. So if you go back to the slide of the installation views of the rack with the religious sculptures, actually we have, and I'll just walk, this exhibition actually worked. I mean, the curators, when we went to the Heritage Conservation Center, this was really how we saw the sculptures that are stored on these racks as well. And if you notice the rack that we have made here, it's really posed as a question, because this is how we saw them as they were stored at the Heritage Conservation Center. And we are bringing it to you to see as how they were also stored. We've also kept even the tags. You can't see here, but if you go a bit closer, you'll see the tags attached to each of these religious sculptures. And this was really much done in the same way as you will see them at the Heritage Conservation Center. Each will have a tag stating what this work is, and so on. So it gives some information about the sculpture as well. Yeah. So I think it's really posed there almost like a question, right? Because it's almost like in the middle of the whole exhibition. You cannot ignore it. To constantly, question and ask ourselves, are these sculptures, are these to be considered or included, in our history of modern sculpture here in Singapore? So I think in that sense, not everything has an answer, but most things starts with a question. Right? If you don't ask the question, then we'll never rethink as what this exhibition aims to do, what sculpture is.
Yeah, we certainly want to hear your views later, right? But right now, any Joleen or Jia?
Yeah, okay. I guess speaking of questions, I think one way we thought about this exhibition and what we hope to do was not to also provide visitors with a definition of what sculpture is today. I think we've found these sort of entry points that we thought were very rich and complex enough to allow visitors to arrive at their own definitions of what sculpture is, and whether or not that term can still be privileged or relevant to them and to artists today. So in fact, in our research of the exhibition, when speaking to when speaking to artists, I think Jia Yun was sharing also that when you speak to Dawu, he says, sculpture as a term is not relevant to him today anymore. And same with Saipo. And I'm also thinking about how Joleen said that, there's no difference. There was never a difference for him between his sculptures and his paintings. And this is something like a key thing that was very important for us curators, was trying to arrive at how artists have already moved on from from such definitions and work with that and work alongside artists, and how to get also audiences to think about how these open reflections about the interrelationship and the interdependence of sculptural engagement with its surrounding social and cultural environment is also very important. Situating sculptural engagement within these different social cultural containers is quite important in thinking about sculpture today. Yeah.
Yes, I think on that point, to think about sculpture beyond its exhibition histories, I think was also important for us, because if we confine ourselves to the study of sculpture through exhibitions, then it already kind of predetermines what is defined as sculpture. So if you see, especially in the first section, a lot of the maquettes and these Hindu temple sculptures don't traditionally belong within the framework of an art space or a white cube kind of context or exhibition. So I think that in itself as a provocation was very important for us to also think about the fact that, yeah, these works have been considered and historicized within their own domains, but what happens when you bring them within the remit of the art historical and the visual, then I think we begin to see that, there are these iconographic traditions that in fact actually have links to the way that contemporary artists are responding to their cultural environment and context now as well. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for that. Those responses. I think yes, a lot to think about, right? A lot to think about, even beyond this show. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because in the first place, who defines sculpture, right? Is it defined in the Western sense, for example, right? Okay. So can we get away from that definition? Okay. In any case, I'd like to move on. Another couple of questions, right? And then. I think in the Renaissance, I think there was a debate, okay, about which is the more nobler art form, right? Painting or sculpture. And in Singapore, up to the late 60s, early 70s, right, the primacy was on the pictorial arts. In fact, all along, right, I would say up to the 60s perhaps, right, even to the 70s. I think there are some reasons for this. For example, there's a lack of formal curriculum, right, in educational institutions, right, on the teaching of sculpture. Secondly, of course, the space, right? We don't have much space here, right, in Singapore for the making or even the display of sculpture. And also, there's also a lack of facilities for making sculpture, like foundries, for example. Okay, if you want to make bronze sculpture, you have to send it abroad, let's say to Thailand. Okay, and also the artists who came here, right? Many of them came from China, and and they came with a very strong pictorial tradition. So in this show, you have included works by artists who are known to be primarily painters. Okay, even Cheong Su Ping, for example, Wee Beng Chong, okay, for example, and many others. So what does this tell us about the sculpture scene in Singapore? Okay, historically, and how did this kind of affected the development of sculpture in Singapore?
Well, I must say our sculptors are very resilient, right? Despite having so little support. And frankly, in terms of the art market, it was always been dominated by painting. And for sculptors, it was really difficult for them. Of course, with some exceptions, VM Hoisington received many commissions. Right? So commissioning was a way for some of them. But it was really very few, and it was very competitive because many commissions were also open, kind of it's an open call, right? And you have to compete, or maybe you are invited to put in a proposal, right, amongst other sculptors. So it was very competitive, and we should acknowledge our artwork was actually quite competitive in that sense, for better or for worse, So I think, yeah, we can say, it's something that, as you rightly pointed out, sculpture wasn't formally taught, and many sculptors, in a sense, learned sculpture, about sculpture, the techniques of sculpture, maybe on their own, or maybe through other sculptors, sharing that knowledge with each other as well. And I think that really points to the kind of not just the resilience, but how sculpture continues to endure, and probably speaks to why it's still so important to artists to think sculpturally, even though they are painters, primarily perhaps, even like Su Ping. Why did Su Ping continue to make so many sculptures? And he made quite a few, not just these metal reliefs, but also sculptures in a three-dimensional form as well. Because I think to think three-dimensionally was a very important way for them to also think about and perhaps reference back to their paintings. And we see that in Anthony Poon or Tei Tian Chong, for example, whereby they move into kind of painting or sculptural reliefs, for want of a better term. So I would, so these are my initial responses, but maybe other curators like to respond.
I think also it's been noted previously. I think this is not the first time, but I think in the 1976 NMAG catalogue, Constance Shears does note that sculpture has this kind of secondary status to painting in Singapore, and she actually then goes on to encourage artists and I think every one of the readers of the catalogue to pay more attention, I think, to sculptors and the kind of artistic possibilities that lie embedded within, making in the round. So I think painting versus sculpture, I think maybe Joleen will also share more in the fourth section, is actually where these categories maybe in a way start to intermingle or collapse, and artists are actually interested or invested in that commingling of definitions. And in a way, I think when those categories are not so clear, therein lies the kind of subversion or innovation as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually reminded of Prof. Sababati's what he said when we spoke to him about it. He said, it's interesting that painting here is already totally contaminated by sculpture, and vice versa as well. I was thinking also about the first sculpture exhibition catalog in 1967, and I think, if I'm not wrong, Choi Wing-yang is the writer, and he's introducing the sculptors in the exhibition, and he notes that apart from Yo Hui Bin and a few other artists, the rest of the artists are actually trained in other mediums or from other disciplines. So he notes like Vincent Hoisington was an interior designer, Lim Shujuan was doing woodcuts. And it was not in a disparaging spirit or that it's not a technical handicap. He said it was with a lot of excitement, and there's possibilities. It's great, and there's this sort of embracing of versatility and artistic versatility. So I think in a way it shows the porosity in which artists were already in Singapore were already thinking about sculpture in a very fluid sense, and often open to different disciplines. And I think this is something that we tried to also foreground in this exhibition about sculptors in Singapore.
Yeah, so I come to my last question before opening it to the floor, right? And this is in regards to public sculpture, okay? I mean, you'll take another session to talk about public sculpture, really, but I think it's important to just discuss a little bit, okay, about what public sculpture is. I mean, by definition, public sculpture is something that is commissioned, right, to be made for a public site and for the public. Okay, and of course, public sculpture, with emphasis on the public, has always been mired in controversy. All right, of course, one of the most famous one is Richard Serra's Gilded Ark, in the US, right, where it was removed because the office workers found it, among other things, ugly, right? It was ugly. Okay, so, but in Singapore, we have our fair share of controversy as well, right? About the kind of the care, the conservation, right, of public sculpture. Okay, and there have been issues about vandalism, okay, about conservation, about works being moved, about works disappearing, not being properly attributed, right? Okay, but at the same time, we're also talking about the importance of placemaking, and community building. Okay, so I'd just like to, by ending of this session, what are some of your thoughts about, public sculpture, right? I have no specific question, but, I just want to know. I think Joleen gave, said something earlier, but the rest, yeah.
I think, okay, I'll just recall a conversation I recently had with a taxi driver. I was just coming out from Lim Shujuan's studio, and I was just telling her why I was at Curatorial Studios. It was really because of the artist studio visits we're going to do. And then I was just telling her about Lim Shujuan's practice, and I was like, oh yeah, do you know that he made, all these like, some sweet woman sculptures, he made a cat along the Singapore River. And she was like, oh yeah, I do know these works, but I do not know who the artist is. So my thoughts, at least, is really that I think we do recognize some of these works, but I think attribution to who the makers are not given. And there should be more recognition for them and more introduction to them, And also, they are artists exhibited in, not just in a gallery, but also out in the open space. So I think, that would be my point of view, yeah.
Maybe we can go to the slide of the Sri Sivan temple, showing the newspaper articles. I think we have not showed that slide yet. When I was giving a tour of Nothing is Forever, can't remember, was it docents or just a general public. One of them mentioned that, hey, all these religious sculptures are actually public art because you see them everywhere, right? When you go to Sri Mariamman Temple, for example, you see them. You go Happar Villa, you see them. In a sense, they are also public art. If you look at these newspaper articles back in 1983, so those religious sculptures that you see now on display in the exhibition were actually mostly from the Sri Sivan temple, not all, most. The Sri Sivan temple had to relocate because of the Dhoby Ghaut MRT station that was being built. So right now they have a new site which they currently still are at today, which is near Geylang. So here you can see the newspaper article, this contractor who was rescuing, these sculptures that were eventually from the original Sri Sivan temple. And they were then eventually donated to the National Heritage Board via the Hindu Endowments Board. But then it was Hindu Endowments Board still, huh? Yeah, Hindu Endowments Board. So it was amazing. And then the contractor was actually a Chinese contractor. But he felt that these were so important, he needed to rescue them. And he took the initiative to do so. And you can see it wasn't an easy task. He had to hoist them and to bring them down. And then to keep them. So we're very thankful to this Mr. Chan Eng Cheng. I suppose that's the reporter, but the contractor who actually saved them. Yeah. So yeah, how about we think about public art? Includes all these sculptures that we see every day. Right?
So just to add on, I think in relation to public art, relying on the state is not enough. I think several examples, the Sri Sivan Temple, an officer from URA actually alerted the National Heritage Board. Even for Yeo Hui Bin's sculpture, it was actually told to us by Mr. Lim Shujuan. He actually told us, okay, come take a look, would you like this to be in the national collection? Even Nolly's work. So all these works would have been lost if not for members of the public. So yeah, I think we ourselves also have a role to play. Maybe we could, keep a lookout and alert whoever necessary. Yeah.
We should start a hotline. Okay. Anyway, I think contractors like that are in a minority, unfortunately. Even myself, I've been searching for sculptures, they've all gone, disappeared. Right? Yeah. By Nolly, Nolly, Rodolfo Nolly was, he has probably, hundreds of works, but you couldn't trace any, Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing about commissions in the sense that they afford artists, I think, a lot of visibility and, they're able to work at a scale that maybe is not so feasible when you have to work within the parameters of your studio. But that's the other challenge because when commissioned works are cited in a public space, or on buildings that no longer exist, which is actually also the case for a lot of Huizington's works. then the history of the artist can also sometimes disappear, with the objects, if there hasn't been that much documentation. So I think then maybe, it's a call to arms for the general public, whether interested in museums or not, to really then look at the surrounding environment and the kind of quiet sculptural objects with fresh eyes, that these things actually may not be around forever as well. And there's a lot of history kind of embedded within each of these objects or instances of making. Yeah, even or especially when they're in the public realm. Yeah.
Okay, so with that, we want to open, this session to the floor.
And Lucas has a mic, so
Ah,
he'll
yes.
hand you the mic if you have any questions.
Yes, there's one here, Lucas.
Hi. Okay. I'd like to ask, the exhibition includes many familiar artists, but the artworks chosen seem to be relatively unique in the context of their practice. So, like, for example, I noticed with Anthony Poon's work, you've included mostly his canvas-based work, but not really any of the maquettes of his public artwork. Or the work by Han Sai-po on display is one that seems more geometric than her usual organic pieces. May I ask you to expand on this, as it seems to be a conscious decision related to the notion of redefining sculptural practice in Singapore?
Hi, thanks for the question. It's a really astute observation. Actually, when Jeffrey asked earlier what were some of our challenges that we faced, one of the things I was thinking of sharing was also that, with doing a so-called show on sculpture like this, it's very hard to pick one work by one artist because their practice can be so varied across a long period of time. Do we show Kim Lim's carvings or Kim Lim's constructed steelworks, or do we show Tan Teng Kee when he was making his steelworks, or do we show it when he is obliterating them? In the end, I think we carefully considered all of this parts of each of their individual practices and mostly whittled it down to looking at the material and technical requirements for that went into the production of the work. So that was a key deciding factor in this regard. And so yes, Sai-po, for instance, is known for her very organic sculptures that are very durable. But we also wanted to show this very different side of Han Sai-po when she was really working with things like cardboard. So that what was made of, constructed from cardboard, which is then painted over, and to really show the kind of ways that artists were responding to the environment at the time and the sort of new tools that were available to them and how that then in turn shaped all these sculptural objects and values that they were thinking about. I hope that answers your question, but do the other curators have anything to add on to that?
Oh, just about Sai-po and that particular work, the tetrahedron, is using high fiberglass, right? And of course, the cardboard forms the structure, if you want.
Yes, cardboard and fiberglass.
Fiberglass. So the coming back to Joleen's point about fiberglass, so it was really kind of this industrial material. So, which is why it's near Lim Leong Seng's rebuild, which is using the steel rebars. So a lot of our kind of decisions were based on, as what Joleen said, the kind of new techniques they were using. Normally, you don't slap fiberglass on the cardboard, right? So they're very innovative in their techniques. Actually, we have not talked about the techniques, which was really such an important aspect of sculpture, right? The use of the innovation of the techniques that they used. For example, Tan Teng Kee is known for his metal structures, metal sculptures that he welds together. So welding becomes a technique, which is not a conventional technique of sculpture. You use molding, casting, but you don't use welding. Welding is really an industrial technique that was then used in modern sculpture. But we didn't show that particular work, but we thought, hey, we have the DBS Singapore Gallery and the work is there. Right? So which comes back to the problem, I think, when Jeffrey talked about challenges, I forgot to mention, the biggest challenge is space. right? And probably all of you will agree that probably this exhibition requires more space, right? And how I wish we had more space, but that's another story. Yeah, we had certain limitations in terms of space.
Thank you very much for this very interesting roundtable. I have two questions. The first one is relating to Lim Leong Seng's work, New Era. So after the exhibition, how would the Conservation Center keep the work? Yeah, that's one question. And the second question, if you could go to the screen where you show the various sculpture exhibitions we had before this.
Can we go to the slide with the exhibition histories?
Yeah, I note that the last exhibition listed here is in 1999. And if I could see clearly, that piece of work there is Victor Tan's work.
Yes, you're
a
right.
very beautiful piece of wire sculpture. So my question is for the curators, in your selection of the works that are to be displayed in this exhibition, did you take into consideration the various types of materials that artists or sculptors would use besides the more conventional of bronze and stone or whatever? Yeah, that's my question, because I think Victor's works are not displayed in this exhibition.
Yeah, I'll answer your second question first. I think you're trying to ask, why didn't we include Victor, right? Victor Tan, and also the material. Yeah, I think as we mentioned earlier, the material is really an important consideration for us. And of course, the exhibition extends from the 19th century or even earlier till the present. And of course, we could have included Victor's works, and we do have his works in our collection as we were doing our viewing as well. But this is not a comprehensive survey, so it's not possible to include every single sculptor. But if you ask me, we had more space. Most certainly would like to include Victor Tan. And of course, his use of wire sculptures, was also very innovative in that way, and it's quite something so immediately recognizable as a work by Victor, right? So, yes, we would if we had more space, most certainly. Your first question is really about New Era, and for New Era, I think it's the kind of work that is very conceptual. So what we have done is, after the exhibition, there's actually nothing that's going to go back to the Heritage Conservation Center. Right? So each time we show the work, we will have to get the plastic bags. Because it's a kind of conceptual work that's ephemeral. So we have actually acquired the concept from the artist rather than the material itself. So there's no physical material that we acquired, which is great. So it doesn't occupy any space at the Heritage Conservation Center. Oh, we've got a question behind.
Yeah, hi, Eugene. Since we are talking about Lim Leong Seng's New Era plastic bag, I have a very superficial question. How often do you have to pump air to keep it there as a sculpture? How often?
Yeah.
That's one. Second, okay, this is the first question.
Yeah, so it's a question that bothered us a lot as well. So Mr. Lim Leong Seng is a very meticulous artist. So what he did before we acquired the work was that he actually tested it over a few months before we acquired it. So all that is actually documented in our database system. Right? And we have put it into an artist manual with all that information. So he actually tested, and according to his first test, it's about 3 months. And if everything goes well and nobody tries to burst it, it should last 3 months to 6 months. And so hopefully sometime in the middle of this exhibition, we will have to change the entire work and bring in a new string of plastic bags and inflate it and display it. So at some point, we'll have to do a change. Yeah. So all that is planned with the artist. Maybe we should do a program where we do the change. It would be quite fascinating.
Just a quick question with Tao's work, the brick and the wires. Can you help me interpret it?
So the work is called Cloud of 68, and he first made it in 1971 when he was a student at Birmingham Polytechnic. So this was a time when the Paris student riots in 1968 had just happened, and I think the kind of reverb, the repercussions and echoes were happening throughout the world, because I think it was maybe the first time in a very kind of a cosmopolitan city that a student-led uprising had led to kind of a huge political kind of waves and consequences. So for Dawu, I think how he wanted to express or explore this concept was this idea that the cloud moved from Paris through to other parts of Europe, and subsequently even Southeast Asia, with the student riots in Manila in 1980s at the Edsa Revolution, and even earlier in the 70s with the student demonstrations in 1973 and 1976 in Bangkok, for example. So Dawu at the time was very much interested in the way in which the materials of brick and wire could represent the gestures and actions of protest. So actually these two key materials are inspired by a French poster that he saw circulating at the time, which translates to the streets are beautiful. And that really refers to the site of protest, where students were able to kind of carry out these actions. So Dawu, as a kind of a young artist himself, I think was very much interested in also experimenting with ideas or illusions of weight, mass, and weightlessness. The original draft of the sculpture was actually made from styrofoam, so it had an even more kind of elevated and floating appearance. But now in 2022, Dawu has determined that the final form of the sculpture should be brick. So it's really, I think, about also the kind of contrast or maybe paradox between the bricks, which do weigh, I think, let's say around 300 kilos, that seem to be kind of suspended above the wire. So I think he was very much interested in playing and exploring with these kind of material paradoxes, while at the same time also pointing to what Joleen has mentioned as the kind of immediate socio-political environment and context within which he was working, even as a young student at the time. Yeah.
Hi, I have two questions. One is a follow-up of Lim Leong Seng's New Era. I understand that we've acquired the concept. So imagine if we are to exhibit it 30 years down the road, and this particular type of plastic bag is not available. Would it make any difference if we use some other type of plastic bag? Or would we have changed work by doing that? The second question is on Jimmy Ong's effigies of Raffles. There's one that is called Buang Sui. And I'm trying to figure out, what is Buang Sui? Is it a Hokkien word for Wang Sui? And
Yes,
that
it is.
It is, okay. And you're looking at Raffles like the emperor who, will live forever and ever, and will be paying homage to this figure of authority. And why is he, I don't know whether the right word is uncursed, because there are two that are uncursed, but in this particular case, it's open up at the back. And by doing so, the Javanese ethics that are inscribed or sewn there have been cut into. Is that an indication that Raffles had broken some of the ethics when he was working in Java and sort of vandalized some of the treasures from Java? Is that why Jimmy Ong had sort of broken the ethics of the Javanese by cutting the back and not the front, like the other two uncursed effigies? Thank you.
Okay, I'll answer the question about Jimmy. So I think in terms of the kind of so-called dissection of the figure. I'm not sure whether he exactly meant for the text to be split, but I think what he did express to us also in the interview was what he emphasized was that he really wanted the figures to become these soft, kind of wearable masses. So in fact, they actually have holes where you can kind of pass your arms through and almost wear the formerly turgid figure of Raffles as a kind of a tiger skin. So he was very much looking at the idea of the unstuffed or uncursed Raffles as a kind of a trophy, to say that we've uncursed ourselves from the colonial karma that Raffles had incurred, during his lifetime. So it's very much, I think, to our benefit rather than to Raffles's benefit, as far as our interviews with him have indicated. Yeah, but I think there was also your other question about Lim Leong Seng.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I mean, like 30 years down the road, hopefully we won't have plastic bags, right? Maybe using something else. So these plastic bags are actually can be bought off the shelf. So I can't remember the actual dimensions, but we have those dimensions, and of course we have kept a lot on our end. But as you know, plastics do degrade over time, as well. Anyway. So if the time comes and we do not have plastics anymore, or plastic bags anymore, we probably still have plastics, we will have to remake it, specially make them rather, which may be a challenge, but I'm sure it can be done, yeah. But I can't say, probably not going to be here anymore. But we tried our best to put in as much information as we can. So I think the worst case scenario will be if our huge stash of plastic bags is somehow not usable because they have degraded, then we will have to make it, specially make them.
Hello. Oh, so I think my question is really related to the space that the exhibition takes up, and you mentioned the use of the spine hall, which extends outside of in a way, like ticketed space into more of a public, like almost the space in which people walk through. And formerly, it was the place where people would buy tickets, but of course we don't have that anymore. So I guess my question is, was there a specific reason that motivated this decision to use the space? Is it related to the idea of public art, for instance? And what are some of the considerations that went into this decision? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. It's actually not easy to use the spine hall, to be honest. Why? Because it's a public space, as you can see, right? And people walk through it. And actually, after the gallery closes at 7, this space is still accessible because we have the restaurants, right? So people do use this space. So there's an issue about the security and safety of the artworks. So I think we have been very brave. We are, and we thought that these large-scale works could be, offer a great experience to see them in the round, in a space that has a double volume with a very high ceiling. And we thought, in a way, yes, some of these, not all of them, were made to be shown in a public space. Yu Huibin's work, Zhong Zhenren, is one of them. And we thought this being a public space offers a great opportunity for sculptures to be seen almost all the time, even after the museum closes at 7 p.m. And what we have also done is to work very closely with our colleagues to monitor the situation. So to be honest, we are very worried every day. Maybe not sleepless nights, but we hope that nothing happens to the sculptures. And if everything goes well, this will show that the spine hall is a great space for us to show works and not having to put up barricades on every single work that takes away the experience of it. So if you look at out of the 7 sculptures, only 1 sculpture has the barricades, right? And we have to put that because the work is on loan from the NUS Museum, and it's a condition of the loan. But for the other sculptures, we have just used a low plinth to show it. And I can tell you, it looks very different because initially we had barricades on all the 7 works, and we were like, oh my God, you know, it really changes our encounter with the work. Yeah, so it's not an easy space to use. We hope that the public, and I believe we need to have trust in the public as well, in this case, and enjoy these 7 sculptures. Yeah.
Last question. Yeah. Oh, a comment. Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem.
I thought, thanks. I'd just like to share my understanding of the title Buang Sui that Jimmy Ong had used in one of his effigies. I understand it's from the Malay language. Buang is throw, Sui is like a curse. So what Jimmy wanted to do, I suppose, was like, we no longer should be under the curse of colonial masters, and therefore Buang Sui. That's my understanding. Thank you.
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose, yeah. I think it was an enjoyable session. Like to thank all the curators, right, for sharing, and to thank our audience for making the time to attend this roundtable. So I suppose there are what you call curators tour, right, in future. Will there be a curators tour?
I think there's one more.
Yeah.
Is there one more? Lucas, do you remember?
It's in November.
November,
okay.
right?
So watch out for that one.
Yes, the posting's not up yet, but look out for it. And I should also take this chance to mention that we do have the sculptor studio visits. They are in September. So there are still tickets, I believe, for some of them. So please sign up, look on our website. And in closing, I guess, thank you to Jeffrey, our moderator, and our curators, Joleen, Jia Yun, Yu Jin, and Shujuan.